So, growing up in my family, we had 4 meals that we ate on a consistent basis. Chicken, hamburgers, pasta, and pork chops. Now, my mom would mix spices and she'd have different sauces, so it wasn't like we were eating the exact same meal. But those 4 were pretty much the standards, and our sides were pretty much the same as well. It was either corn on the cob, potatoes, or salad. Only ranch if you had a salad. And so I didn't have broccoli, I'd never had asparagus, I'd never had grilled carrots or anything like that. Until I got married, when Gail married me, she said, I'm not going to have a husband that has never had broccoli. You're going to have to try this. And so thankfully my palate has been opened up to all sorts of wonderful fresh veggies and fruits and all of that. I love them. The only one that I don't like, just confession, the only vegetable that I will not eat is Brussels sprouts. Because, amen, they taste like bad breath, right? Who wants to eat those? There is one fruit, however. There's one fruit on all the earth that I have never eaten. There's one fruit that I will never, ever eat. In fact, I would rather have my head set on fire than put out with a shovel than eat this particular fruit. What is it that you ask? The fruit that I've never eaten in my life? It's a tomato. The crowd gasped. Listen, I've never had a tomato. I had to double check to make sure that a tomato was actually a fruit, because I just don't care anything about tomatoes. I've never had one in my life. Never had them. And the reason that I've never had them is because one of my earliest childhood memories, I was sitting at the table with my family. My mom sat down and she had this sliced tomato out on the plate there. My dad said, "Look at that thing. Look at that tomato. It's all slimy and it's all gross and it slithers down your throat. And look at the seeds. That's gross." And so, when you're a little kid, you want to be like Dad. So I said, "Yeah, down with tomatoes." To this day, I've never eaten one. Now, please do not, after service, try to convince me that tomatoes are wonderful. Please don't tell me a story how there's nothing better than a tomato on a hot day sliced up with fresh pepper. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to have it. Don't tell me that I need to try fried green tomatoes because they're just so good. I won't even watch the movie, let alone eat fried green tomatoes. It's just not going to happen. That is a vile fruit. Tomatoes, to me, are like cats. There really is no point to them whatsoever. I had somebody tell me they wanted to throw tomatoes at me after that. And somebody else said they wanted to throw a cat at me. So I'm just offending everybody left and right. But, so this week we're continuing our message, God on the Loose. And this week's message is entitled, You Are What You Eat. So let me start out by asking you a question. Have you ever had your whole perspective on life change in a moment? I mean, have you ever had something happen to you, and when it did, everything you thought, everything you believed, and everything you felt was called into question? Maybe it wasn't even a thing. Maybe it was a person. When I was in high school and I was in college, I knew exactly what the girl would look like that I was going to marry. She was going to have curly blonde hair and blue eyes. And then my junior year of college, I fell in love with a red-headed, brown-eyed girl. God changed my perspective. I thought I knew exactly who I was going to marry, but when I met my wife, everything changed for me. God has a way of doing that, right? God has a way of taking what we believe and what we've always thought and turning it upside down. He has a way of challenging us. God has that way of doing that. He will take those things that you hold dear, those things that you know are right, and He will say, nope, I'm going to flip that. I'm going to change that on you. He's going to take the way that we've always lived our lives, and He will challenge our personal preferences, and He will challenge our beliefs, and He will challenge our religious rituals, the ones that we've always had. It happened to Peter in our story from Acts this morning. We have this story from Acts. It's kind of a strange story, where Peter goes up to the roof to pray, and he realizes that he's hungry, and all of a sudden he falls into a trance, and the skies open up, and a sheet comes down from heaven. And on that sheet are all sorts of animals, reptiles, birds, all sorts of animals. Now Peter, when he sees these animals, doesn't even have to think about it. He knows just by looking at them that those animals on that sheet are unclean. He just knows it. He's known that all his life. He's known, you don't touch those animals, you don't eat those animals. And then God says something to him that definitely threw him for a loop. God says, Peter, get up, kill and eat the animals on that sheep. Again, all his life, Peter had been told that those animals are off limits, to not touch them. They're unclean. The rules say he's not to eat them, and Peter says, hey, I've never eaten those animals. So could we blame Peter if he thought that God was testing him? Could we blame Peter if he's like, God, I know what you're doing. I'm not going to fall for your trap this time. I can understand that. But then God throws him another curve. Peter says, no, I'm not going to eat that, Lord. Those are unclean animals. I've never eaten them. I've always followed the rules. And God says to him, Peter, don't call what I've created unclean. I mean, how do you respond to that? 3 times Peter sees this vision, and finally the sheep is pulled back up to heaven, leaving Peter perplexed about what this could possibly mean. You know, I realize that there are a lot of things that you and I, when it comes to religion, that you and I, when it comes to rituals, are not going to agree on. There are things that you have, there are preferences that you have in worship, and there are ways that you go about your religious practices that I won't agree with, and there are things that I do that you probably won't agree with. But I think we all can get behind one thing. That God's desire for his children is not division. That God does not desire that we separate ourselves by gender or by race or by theology or by political perspective. God is not interested in the Christian right, nor is he interested in the Christian left. So our story today ends with the sheep in Acts going up to heaven. That's how our reading ended today. But if you continue on, the story gets a little bit more interesting. As soon as the sheep is pulled up into heaven, these 3 men that Cornelius had sent to find Peter show up at the house. And the Spirit says to Peter, there are men here, they're here to see you, and Peter goes down to meet them. You see, that day God wasn't just changing Peter's menu. He was changing the lens on how he viewed those people. God wasn't just changing the menu of food. He wasn't just talking about unclean animals. God was about to completely rock Peter's world. God was about to say, you know those people that aren't like you? Those are the people I want you to go to. Those people those people who had always been at best deplorable and at worst your enemies, Peter, now I want you to go and to discover that they too are included, that I love them, that they too are my children. That's a huge change for Peter, maybe even bigger than being asked to kill and eat those animals. I mean, sure, Peter followed around Jesus and he watched Jesus go to those that were considered unclean, and he watched Jesus minister to those that were outside the circle. But that was Jesus, right? This is Peter. This was challenging everything he had ever known. All of a sudden, he was being asked to change his lens through which he had always seen those people over there, those people that weren't part of his crew. And so Peter invites these 3 men to stay the night at his house, and the next day he sets off to meet with Cornelius. Peter knows that what he's doing is out of the ordinary. He knows that what he's doing will probably be questioned by the followers. He knows that he may even upset some of his people by visiting those people, and yet he goes anyway. In fact, Peter tells them how uncomfortable and how he's breaking the rules in this moment. Later on in Acts, he says this to them when he comes to Cornelius' house. He says, you know it's against our laws for a Jewish man to enter a Gentile home like this, or to associate with you. But God has shown me that I could no longer think of anyone as impure or unclean. So I came without objection as soon as I was sent. And then Cornelius goes on to tell Peter about his vision, that Cornelius was praying and all of a sudden a man in white showed up. And this man in white told Cornelius that God had heard his prayer. And God had taken notice of the gifts that Cornelius had been giving to the poor. And then Peter's lens becomes even more clear for him. He says this, I see very clearly that God shows no favoritism. Peter, in that moment, realized that God's love is not just for a certain group of people, but it's for all those who fear him and all who do what is right. So the next question that I have for you this morning is simply this. What's on your sheet? Where does your lens need to change? If you were to climb to the roof of this church immediately after this service, and you were to fall into a trance, and the skies were to open up, and a sheet were to come down from heaven, what would be on that sheet for you? I don't know what that is for you, but I know what it's not. It's not something comfortable. It's probably not something easy. And I know for sure that the sheet that would come down from heaven for you would not be empty. Something would be there. Something or some person or some group of people would be there. So what's on your sheet? I mean, do you honestly believe that Peter didn't have just a little bit of discomfort as he was making this journey to Cornelius' house? I mean, he named it, right? He says, this isn't right that I'm here. I'm not supposed to associate with you. We're not supposed to talk to each other. We're not supposed to get along. I'm certainly not supposed to pray with you. My people are going to be upset that I'm talking to you. Just a little confession, I get really too caught up sometimes in the idea that following Jesus simply means praying to Him and praising Him. But following Jesus doesn't just mean attending worship for an hour a week. It's so much more than just the hour that we put in on Sunday mornings. Heck, being a member of a church means going beyond that hour. It means committing your life to something bigger. It means making that a priority. It means worshiping God a priority. It means using your spiritual gifts for the greater good. It means making this a priority not just Sundays, but Monday through Saturday, including Sundays. Following Jesus, though, means being led into the uncomfortable. It means sharing and showing the love of Christ not just to our people. That's easy. It's easy for us to show love to one another. It means showing God's love to those people as well. Because when we do that, we'll come to understand what Peter did when his lens was changed. That those people are actually God's people, which makes them our people as well. I know, but some of you might be thinking, what in the world does this have to do with you are what you eat? Well, let's take that phrase literally. In a couple of minutes, you'll be invited up here to the table. Everyone will be invited to communion. And you'll be handed not a piece of bread, but you will be handed the body of Christ. Will you be what you eat in that moment? Will you be the hands of Christ? Will you be the feet of Christ? Will you be Christ's voice out in the world? Will you be the body of Christ, not just in this hour, but all hours of the day? When I used to read this story, I would really give Peter a hard time. He kind of annoyed me, because I thought his response to God at first was ridiculous. God tells him to get up, to kill those animals and to eat them. That's a direct order from God, and yet Peter goes, whoa, 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 I'm not supposed to do that. That's against the rules, God. But the reality is, we all get hung up on rules, right? So much so sometimes we get hung up on our rules and our rituals that it can get in the way of what God is calling us to do. So I attended the greatest seminary in the world, the Lutheran School of Theology, which by the name is in the greatest city in the world, Chicago. And I did great in all of my seminary classes. I got nothing lower than a B except one class. There was one class that I got a C- in. Which means if I were to go another grade lower, if I were to get a D, I would have to retake this particular class. So which was it? Not Greek, not Hebrew, not systematic theology, but the class that I almost had to repeat in seminary was Worship 101. I almost failed worship class. Now some of you might go, that's what's wrong with Pastor Mike up there. He doesn't know what he's doing. But in all actuality, the reason that I got a C- in my worship class is very simply, I didn't do worship the way my professor said it had to be done. I asked questions like, why do we do it this way? And the response that I got did not satisfy me. It was, that's just how we do worship. Like, did you know that if you were to take this class, that when you're up standing at communion, you're supposed to hold the bread, you're supposed to hold your arms at a 90-degree angle. 90 degrees. Yeah, that's about right. And then, you were supposed to raise the bread and lower it in 10 seconds. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Did you know that when you hold the cup, you're supposed to hold it for 7 seconds? 7. Not 6.5, Not 8, but 7 seconds. This is how we do worship in our church, my professor would say. You hold the bread like this. You heat the cup up like that. You enunciate these words. You're quiet on these words. You're reverent with this. You're excited about that. All of these rules. This was how you did worship. My professor was an awesome man. I loved him. His name was Dr. Mark Banger. He was really cool. Now, maybe you think when you hear that name, well, he must have just been like some traditionalist who, was just kind of this stuffed shirt who didn't want to change anything. The reality is, Dr. Banger was kind of a reformer in his time. He was part of what's called Seminex, which simply was short for Concordia Seminary in Exile. Basically, in a nutshell, what he did was he was part of the Missouri Synod Seminary, and he didn't believe that what they were teaching was right. And so he, along with a couple of his colleagues and some professors, walked out of the seminary. Hence the name Seminarians in Exile. That's how they would call themselves. You see, he believed that what the church was preaching was wrong, and he was willing to walk away from the Missouri Synod Church. And so this man who took on an entire institution, who was a rebel, who walked away from his church, even this rebel had rules and rituals that he believed could not be broken. We all, like Peter, have certain perspectives and rules that we keep. Things that we would have a hard time being challenged on. Rules that we've had for most of our lives. So I asked earlier, what's on your sheet? Where is God challenging you? Where does God want you to change your lens? Again, I can't tell you what that is, but I can bet with almost certainty that what lies on that sheet for you is a challenge. Is a challenge to your rules. Is a challenge to your rituals. Is a challenge of the way that you have always viewed life. What's on your sheet are those people that you've distanced yourselves from, that I've distanced myself from. What's on that sheet might cause a lot of people, in fact, to dig their heels in. Maybe if you were to see your sheet, you go, nope, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to stick with my rituals, I'm going to stick with my rules, I'm going to stick with the way that I've always done it. There's a great comic that's been going around on Facebook in one way or another, maybe you've seen it. It's Jesus, and he's talking to the crowd, and he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then the next caption is the crowd as Jesus is standing, guys have their hands up, and they say, but Jesus, what if my neighbor is Jewish? What if my neighbor is Muslim? What if my neighbor is gay? What if my neighbor is agnostic? What if my neighbor doesn't look like me? What if my neighbor doesn't talk like me? And then the final caption, Jesus takes a deep breath and goes, okay, I'm going to try this one more time. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. So listen up, rule followers. Listen up, those of you who love Excel spreadsheets. Listen up, those of you who, when you buy a piece of furniture to put together, you take the instructions out and read them line by line by line by line. That's not me, so I make fun of you all the time. Those of you who love to follow rules, those of you who love to call out others who don't do things the way you think they should be done, we do have a rule to follow. In fact, we have 2 rules to follow. When your sheet comes down, I can tell you the exact rules that you and I are supposed to follow. Love God and love your neighbor. If at any point our sheet comes down and we see a person or a group of people, or we see a person or a group of people and we refer to them as those people, go back and read the rule book. It'll take you 5 seconds. Hear again the words of Peter. I truly understand that God shows no partiality. But in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. Now, there may be some people who say, see, there it is, right there, Pastor Mike. There it is. It says right there, anyone who fears him and anyone who does right is acceptable to him. Pastor Mike, you've got to fear him and you have to do what's right to be acceptable by God. And so my response to you is simply this. Do you always fear God? Do you always do what is right? If you do, I invite you to stand. Jesus would like to welcome you to the service. We all fall short. Nobody here gets it right 100% of the time. We are all challenged by God. I don't know about you, but I would rather get to heaven and find out I was wrong because I accepted too many people than get to heaven and find out I was wrong because I excluded too many people. Being a follower of Jesus will challenge you beyond your comfort zone. You will be asked to love people that you can't stand. You will be asked to love those people who challenge your views. You will be asked to love people you know need to change. You will be asked to love people you know need to fix their marriage. You know need help with their addiction. You know need help controlling their anger. You will be asked to love all of those people. What's on that sheet is challenging. What's on that sheet is life-altering. What's on that sheet is anything but comfortable. The good news of the gospel sometimes is that it doesn't sound like good news, but it is. It's life-altering. Your sheet is full of people who you don't have the power to change, but you do have the power to love them. It's the love of Christ that will change those who need to be changed, just like it's the love of Christ that will change you and will change me. Amen. The peace of Christ be with you always. You share that peace with one another.